They laughed in court until they saw the man they zip-tied in the rain was now their new boss. Some men walk into a courtroom like they own the place. Bradley Knox was one of those men. Sunglasses tucked into the collar of his shirt, gum in his mouth, and that same smug little smirk that said, "I'm untouchable." Right behind him, Derek Bell followed, whispering something that made both of them laugh under their breath as they slid into their seats like they were early for a lunch meeting, not a misconduct hearing. Both were still in uniform, not because they had to be, but because they wanted to remind everyone exactly who they were. Two decorated officers from the East Precinct in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Two men who believed the badge gave them power, not responsibility. Across the aisle sat Jamal Ellison, 22 years old, quiet, dressed in a navy button-up with sleeves rolled down to hide the bruises on his wrist. He didn't look at the officers. His mother did, though, stared straight through them. She didn't blink, not once. The courtroom itself wasn't large, just 50 or so chairs, stained beige carpet, humming overhead lights, and a dusty clock that ticked too loudly. A public hearing, misconduct review, officer-involved incident. Those were the words on the door. But inside, everyone knew what this really was. A test of whether a system built to protect the powerful would finally hold them accountable. The judge hadn't entered yet. Lawyers whispered. Someone from Internal Affairs leaned forward, flipping through a file. Knox leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, chewing harder now. He tapped Bell's shoulder and nodded toward Jamal. "You believe this kid's still trying to act like he ain't do nothing wrong?" he muttered. Bell didn't answer, just shook his head and smiled. 3 years on the force had taught them one thing above all else. If you say it with confidence, if you wear the uniform, you can get away with just about anything. Their lawyer, a gray-haired man with a folder thicker than a phone book, turned around. "You boys relax," he said under his breath. "We've danced this dance before. Just answer what you're asked. Don't volunteer. Don't admit anything. They don't have proof." Knox grinned. "That's what I like to hear." Then the door to the side of the bench opened. Everyone turned. It wasn't the judge. A woman in a brown pantsuit stood from the corner and tapped the mic in front of the bench. Feedback echoed briefly through the room. The chatter died down. "Before we begin this morning's hearing," she said, "I'd like to introduce someone important, someone who will be overseeing internal reforms and leadership transitions within this department." She paused, glancing toward the back of the courtroom. He was appointed just last week by the mayor's office, and today is his first official public appearance in this role. Knox raised an eyebrow. Bell straightened up a little. The woman continued, "Please welcome the new chief of police for the Tulsa Metropolitan Department, Chief Andre T. Lawson." The courtroom didn't erupt in applause. It didn't have to. Instead, there was something heavier. A pause. A shifting in chairs. A breath being held all at once. The back door opened, and in stepped a tall, clean-cut black man in a tailored charcoal gray suit. No badge, no entourage, just presence. Calm, focused. As he walked down the center aisle, Knox's smirk faded. Bell squinted. Because they knew that face. 3 years ago, same eyes, same build, same man they left on the curb in the rain, hands zip-tied behind his back, all because he was driving like he didn't belong there. Andre stopped in front of the bench, shook hands with the judge, then turned to face the room. His expression never changed, but his eyes met Knox's, then Bell's, and he remembered. They did too, but this time he wasn't the one in handcuffs. 3 years earlier, just after 9 p.m., a light drizzle tapped the windshield as Andre turned onto 91st Street near South Mingo Road in Tulsa. He was driving a silver 2020 Audi A6, windows up, jazz playing low on the stereo. He had just wrapped a late dinner meeting with a city council member. Back then, he was a district captain, not yet someone with real authority, but already a man making waves. His record was spotless. His file was thick with commendations. But none of that mattered when the red and blue lights flared behind him. He sighed, slowed, pulled over to the shoulder without hesitation, hands at 10 and 2, engine off. Window cracked just enough to talk. He didn't panic, but something inside him stiffened. That quiet voice that had been conditioned over a lifetime to be cautious, respectful, invisible. Knox approached first, hand already resting on the grip of his gun. "License and registration," he barked. Andre turned his head slowly. "Good evening, officer. May I ask what the stop is for?" Knox narrowed his eyes. "We'll get to that. License and registration." Andre nodded. "I'm reaching into the glove box." He moved deliberately, no sudden motions. He knew the dance. Bell walked up on the passenger side and shined his flashlight through the glass. "Fancy car," he said. "You rent this?" "No," Andre replied calmly. "It's mine." Bell chuckled. "What do you do?" "I work for the city." City worker with an Audi. Must be a good gig." Knox snatched the license from his hand and looked it over, then looked at Andre again. "This your current address?" "Yes." "You live around here?" "No, I was headed home. I live on the north side." Knox exchanged a glance with Bell, then leaned down. "Out of your zip code this time of night? That's funny, huh?" Andre didn't answer. Knox leaned closer. "Pop the trunk." "For what reason?" Andre asked, eyes forward. "Probable cause," Knox said flatly. "We got reports of a vehicle matching yours connected to a drug deal 2 blocks away." "That's a lie," Andre said, still calm. "And that's not probable cause." "Step out of the vehicle." "No." Knox opened the door himself. "Get out now." Andre stepped out slowly, hands up, shoes hitting wet pavement. Bell moved in, patting him down roughly. "You've got no right to search my car," Andre said firmly. Knox spun him around, shoved him against the car. "No right? You gonna tell us how to do our jobs?" Andre didn't resist. He didn't yell, but something in his eyes stayed sharp. They zip-tied his wrists, left him standing there for 30 minutes, in the rain. They tore through his car, threw his papers into the back seat, tossed his gym bag on the ground. Found nothing. Bell clicked his tongue. "Guess it's not your lucky night." Knox walked over. "We'll cut you loose with a citation for a busted taillight. You can thank us for not towing your car." "My taillight isn't broken," Andre said. "It is now," Knox said, already scribbling. Bell laughed. They unzipped his wrists, tossed the citation at his feet, walked back to their cruiser like nothing happened. Andre stood there, shoulders soaked, heart pounding, not with fear, but with something colder. He picked up the citation, looked back at the officers, memorized every detail of their faces, didn't say a word, got in his car, and drove off. But something changed in him that night. Back in the courtroom, the air had shifted. Not a word had been said, but everyone felt it. Chief Andre T. Lawson stood quietly near the bench. He wasn't looking for applause. He didn't need a microphone. Just his presence alone spoke louder than anything Knox or Bell could say in their defense. Knox tried to lean back like nothing was wrong, but his eyes kept flicking over to Lawson. Bell stared straight ahead, arms crossed, jaw tight. Neither of them spoke. Andre turned, walked to the row reserved for officials, and took a seat, 3 chairs away from Jamal Ellison and his mother. Jamal looked over, confused at first. Then his mom leaned in and whispered, "That's him." Jamal blinked. "The new chief?" His mom nodded slowly. Jamal stared at Lawson for a long moment, like he wasn't sure if he should feel hope or just brace for another letdown. The judge finally entered. An older black woman with silver-streaked braids pulled back into a low bun. Her nameplate read, Judge Carla Denton. "Let's begin," she said. "This is a misconduct review regarding officers Bradley Knox and Derek Bell, accused of planting evidence, unlawful search, and excessive force." As she read the charges, Lawson didn't look at the officers. He looked at Jamal. There was no anger in his face, no grudge, just something more powerful. Intention. On the defense bench, Knox's lawyer leaned in. "Keep your cool. Don't let him rattle you." "He doesn't have that kind of authority in here," Knox muttered. "No, but he has it out there," Bell replied quietly. The lawyer said nothing. Across the room, the lead from Internal Affairs, Lieutenant Rachel Kim, stood and read off the body cam report. Footage was accidentally erased. Radio logs showed inconsistencies. GPS data from the cruiser didn't match the report. Everything was thin, but together, it started painting a picture. Then Jamal took the stand. He didn't shout, didn't cry. He just spoke. "They stopped me because they said my windows were too dark. They said they smelled weed. I don't smoke. Never have." He looked toward his mom. "They said they found a bag in the back seat, but that wasn't mine. I don't even know what it was. I kept saying it wasn't mine, and Officer Bell said, well, someone has to take the fall. Gasps rippled through the room. The defense attorney objected, said it was hearsay. Judge Denton overruled. After Jamal stepped down, Chief Lawson stood. I'd like to request permission to speak, he said calmly. The judge raised an eyebrow. As a witness? No, ma'am, Lawson said. As an officer of this department. Knox swallowed hard. Bell looked down at the table, because in that moment, they knew this wasn't going to play out like all the others. Judge Denton glanced around the room. I'll allow it, briefly. Chief Lawson stepped forward, buttoned his suit jacket, and stood in the same spot where Jamal had just been. He didn't look at Knox or Bell, not yet. He looked at the room. I wasn't always a chief, he began. I started as a beat cop, just like most of the people in this room. East Side, long hours, hot summers, real people, real problems. I signed up because I believed in the work, not the power. He paused. Let the silence breathe. I had a mother who taught me to speak clearly and walk with purpose. A father who never lived long enough to see me wear the badge. A baby brother who got pulled over one night and didn't make it home. Heads shifted in the audience. Andre continued. I worked twice as hard for half the recognition. I sat through meetings where people talked around me like I wasn't there. I trained officers who outranked me months later, but I didn't quit. He turned, now facing Knox and Bell. I don't believe in revenge. That's not what I'm here for. I believe in accountability, and I believe in memory. Knox shifted in his seat. Bell stared at the table. 3 years ago, Lawson said, I was pulled over, not as a suspect, not as a criminal, just a man headed home from work. I was treated like I didn't belong on the road I paid taxes for. I was searched without cause, humiliated, cited for a broken taillight that wasn't broken until it was kicked in. He let that sit. I didn't yell. I didn't resist. But I remembered. He glanced at Jamal. Because that's the only power some of us are given. Memory, endurance. Then he looked at the judge. I'm not here to influence your ruling. That's not my role. But I am here to say that the days of looking the other way are done. Under my leadership, this department is going to be different. And that starts with how we treat people who have no power in the moment, but every right to dignity. He stepped down without fanfare, walked back to his seat, didn't puff his chest, didn't gloat. The courtroom was quiet. The judge finally spoke. Thank you, Chief Lawson. And then, as if everything had shifted all at once, the mood in the courtroom settled into something else, something sharper. This wasn't about two bad cops anymore. This was about everyone who had ever been told to just take it. But Knox and Bell still believed they could spin the story their way. Officer testimony started next. Internal Affairs called Officer Denise Vargas to the stand. She'd worked the same precinct as Knox and Bell for 4 years. Everyone expected her to play defense, protect the blue line, say what needed to be said, then go back to her post. But when she took the stand, she didn't look at them. Not once. Instead, she opened a small notebook, flipped to a marked page, and read, On March 8th, I was working dispatch when I overheard Knox and Bell arguing about a report. Knox said, and I quote, You got rid of it, right? I don't need that body cam footage floating around. Bell said, Relax. I took care of it. There were audible reactions in the courtroom. Even the court reporter's fingers slowed for a second. The defense attorney stood. Objection, that's speculative and undocumented. Judge Denton waved it off. This is a misconduct hearing, not a criminal trial. Continue, Officer Vargas. She turned another page. That same night, Officer Bell came into the break room and told me he was sick of these kids thinking they can talk back. I didn't know what he meant at the time. Now I do. Bell's face turned red. Knox leaned over and whispered something, but Bell didn't answer. Then came the neighbor from 2 doors down from Jamal's house. A middle-aged man named Thomas Reed. White, blue collar, denim jacket, hands folded in his lap. He looked nervous, like he wasn't used to speaking in front of this many people. I saw the stop from my porch, he said. Didn't think much of it till I heard one of them say, Make it stick. That didn't sound right to me. What did you do then? Asked the IA rep. I took a picture, Reed said, of the officers going through the kid's back seat. Then I saw one of them pull something from his own pocket and drop it under the seat. Knox bolted upright. "That's a lie." Judge Denton slammed her gavel. "One more outburst, Officer Knox, and you'll be escorted out." Thomas didn't even flinch. "I got the photo. Time-stamped. You can see the angle." The image was displayed on the monitor. It didn't show the handoff clearly, but it was enough to raise serious doubt. Enough for the room to shift again. The mood was no longer a question of if they did it. It was how long they'd been doing it. Next came the footage. Not body cam, they erased that. But a nearby gas station had a pole camera that caught the edge of the stop. Just enough to see the outline of Bell pulling something from his own jacket, then stepping into the back seat area. Silence. Even the defense attorney stared at the screen like he hadn't seen that before. Then he closed his folder and leaned over to whisper something to Knox. Knox looked pale now. Bell's hand shook slightly. Judge Denton leaned forward. "Do either of you wish to change your statements before we proceed to a decision?" Knox didn't speak. Bell cleared his throat, eyes glassy. I didn't know it would go this far." He looked at Jamal for the first time. I didn't think anyone would believe him over us." No one said a word, because there was nothing left to say. Judge Denton sat in silence for a moment. Not because she needed time to think, she already knew, but because the silence itself said something no gavel ever could. She looked at Knox, then Bell. "Officers Bradley Knox and Derek Bell," she began, her voice steady. "This hearing has brought forward disturbing, consistent, and credible testimony. The evidence presented shows a clear pattern of misconduct, abuse of authority, and falsification of reports." She let the words hang. "I am recommending immediate termination of employment for both officers, pending final review by the Police Commission. Additionally, this court will refer all findings to the District Attorney's Office for possible criminal charges." Knox slumped. Bell nodded slowly, as if he'd finally accepted it. But that wasn't the end. Judge Denton turned to the gallery. "Before we adjourn, Chief Lawson has asked to make a final statement." Andre stood again, walked to the front. No notes, no papers, just him. He looked around the room, locking eyes with people. Jamal, his mother, Officer Vargas, even Thomas Reed. "I didn't come here today to settle an old score," he said. "This isn't about revenge. It's about the kind of department we're building and the kind of city we want to live in." He turned slightly toward Knox and Bell. "What happened to me 3 years ago could have happened to anyone who looked like me. And it did happen. To Jamal, and probably to others who never got their day in court." He paused, just enough to let the weight settle. "But here's what matters. Today, the truth came out. Because people spoke up. Because silence wasn't enough anymore." He glanced back at Jamal. "Being young, being black, being in the wrong place shouldn't be a crime. And wearing a badge doesn't make you immune to consequences." Then he stepped back. The judge gave a single nod. "Court is adjourned." As people stood, there was no applause, just quiet acknowledgement. Jamal's mother exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Jamal didn't move at first. He just stared at the now empty bench where the judge had been. Then he looked at Lawson. The two men nodded, barely, subtly. Outside, the sky had cleared, just a little. As Andre walked down the courthouse steps, reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but he didn't stop. He had work to do, and the city was finally ready to listen. This story isn't just about one hearing. It's about every time someone in power thought they could do whatever they wanted and never get caught. It's about what happens when people remember and refuse to stay silent. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll past. Speak up. Pay attention. Share the truth. Change doesn't start in a courtroom. It starts with people like you refusing to look away.